I guess I was sorry. I was thinking that they're easier prey
Yeah,
with multiple children. They're not.
Yeah,
they're easier pickings. That's what I mean. And
yeah, that's right. Yes, they are.
right. So the fragmentation. So if you have a fragmented couple of relationships and you're a woman, you end up with children. You're no longer 20 and single. You're 28 or 35. You have two children. The array of high quality men that you have to choose from is going to decrease substantially.
Yes, it was never very great to begin with.
Right. Okay, so then we add to that. I studied alcohol for years and its effects on violence. And you can basically say that if people didn't get drunk, half the violence in the world would instantly disappear. So rape, murder, familial abuse, the contribution of alcoholism is stunningly high, stunningly high. So maybe that's the third factor that plays in it. Was that reasonable?
Well, it's certainly, it's unmistakably a part of it, yes. Yeah,
Say 50% of murderers are drunk when they kill and 50% of victims are intoxicated when they die.
yeah.
So it's a major, and it's the only drug that has that magnitude of an effect on violent behavior. So then low educational attainment.
Yes, that's obviously very important, and interestingly, the state does very little to try to address it or try to make things better.
Okay, and then beliefs. What?
Okay, let me stop you there again because, okay, lower education. Okay, so lawyers, we all know these things. Okay, we all know this. Most of us know this. Lawyers are scum, both sides. It's all about the money on both sides. If you have money, then you don't go to jail. It's obvious. We all know this. Anybody that comes from wealth is not going to, first of all, they're less likely to be harassed in the first place. Second of all, they can break huge laws. These laws that they make up specifically for people that are in poverty, right? So you can spit on the sidewalk and get harassed, and if you don't pay the fine, then you'll get a warrant put out for your arrest in a poverty situation. Or if you're throw a cigarette butt on the ground, or any of these other small laws. I'm not talking about small little misdemeanor law breaking thing, kind of like I was talking about the fishing license thing before.
Changes of behavior currently.
Yes, yeah, which is,
So in other words,
there's an element of truth in that in the economic
the bank
aspect.
is the lawyer, the cop,
because
the politicians that are making up the ridiculous
they're not going to get good jobs, even if they
nothing
behave
happens to
responsibly and so on. They're not going to get good jobs. However, their lives will be better if they behave responsibly. But another thing that I mean, this is very speculative, but I thought that lots of people have become stars in their own soap opera, and they prefer a dramatic life, a life full of incident, to a life that would be actually very flat if they did the kind of things that you and I would suggest. Their lives might be very flat because they would not be well off. They would still be struggling economically and so on, and their lives would be very, very dull.
Well, that's Dostoevsky's famous criticism of socialist utopia, right? People are fundamentally unable to deal with satiated dullness. They'll break it, they'll fragment it just so that something dramatic and exciting happens. And there's definitely truth in that. I think that's a testament to some degree to the adventurousness of the human spirit, even though it's something that can, well, manifest it in the ways that you describe.
Yeah, well,
Boring.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've fled. I mean, I can't say that I haven't. I I haven't liked chasing sensation myself, because when I was younger, I used to like danger of a certain kind. I used to like going to countries which were dangerous. I crossed Africa by public transport in days when it was impossible to communicate with anyone. There were no mobile phones or anything, so I was incommunicado for months at a time.
Well, and you did work in prisons as a psychiatrist.
Yeah, well, I didn't. I never felt really that was very dangerous. But countries where there's civil war and so on are dangerous, and I liked it. But I always felt, I suppose, maybe falsely, that there was some higher purpose. It wasn't just a liking for danger. There was some kind of purpose behind it all.
Well, there is some utility in seeking out adventure and strife. If that's integrated into a functional, and productive, generous, honest life, that's better. It's better. So obviously, in and of itself, it can become a problem. But so, how did you handle this emotionally?
Which
Well, the endless onslaught of misery amongst your clientele.
well, I mean, one way of dealing with it, of course, was writing about it. Because what I found is that when you write about an experience, even an unpleasant experience, it distances you from that experience. So you not only having the experience, you're observing having the experience. I was once arrested in Albania, and mildly, if you could say, mildly beaten with a truncheon by a policeman. And actually, as he was hitting me, I wasn't thinking this is painful. I was thinking, how am I going to describe this subsequently? So that being able to describe it, or having the intention of describing it, actually distances yourself in a good way, I think, from your experience.
Well, you draw the conclusions that way, and I mean, the purpose of your memory, in some sense, is to draw the appropriate conclusions from your experience to guide you into the future. And so, I have a series of writing exercises online at a place called selfauthoring.com that steps people through writing a biography, and it highlights experiences that were emotionally extreme, and because there is plenty of evidence that writing them out, they have to be somewhat distant from you,
Yes, you can't do it the next day.
Yes, exactly, because you're just re-traumatizing yourself in some sense, but the evidence is quite strong, I would say, that doing that, well, you're transforming the emotion into words and replacing, in some sense, the emotion by the words. You're making sense of it.
Yeah. There was a very interesting experience. I had an interesting experience with that in that regard in the prison. We had a writer who would come in and teach writing, creative writing, if you like, to interested prisoners. And they were, of course, a selected group and so on. And the writer, he came to me because, of course, there wasn't really any evidence that he was doing any good, because, of course, that such evidence would be almost impossible to gather.
Right.
And so, of course, the prison authorities are all constantly trying to cut down costs, so they wanted to get rid of them. So he wanted me to write in his favour, which I did, which, of course, sealed his fate. But but anyway, he told me something very interesting. All the people who wrote autobiographically, as you would expect, and they would come to a point in their lives when they had to stop, when they found it extremely difficult to go on, because actually what it did, this was the first time in their lives they'd really ever thought biographically.
Or perhaps even thought.
Well, maybe.
Well, I really mean that. It's like, that people think they think, but what happens is thoughts appear in their head. That's way different than sitting down programmatically and voluntarily going over your life and trying to make sense of it.
Anyway, they came to a point where they couldn't go on, at least for quite a long time. And that point was when they realized that all that they'd been telling themselves about their own behavior was actually false. And so I came to the conclusion that this actually, now whether it changed their behavior subsequently, I can't tell you. I don't know. And anyway,
Well, you probably need to marry that with a plan.
yeah,
Like the problem is that if you realize that what you're doing is wrong, but it's habitual and you don't know what else to do,
yeah.
you're going to do what you know, because what else are you going to do? You don't know it else.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about the statistics at any rate in Britain are quite clear that people stop coming into prison on new offences. I mean, overwhelmingly, not absolutely 100%, but overwhelmingly for offences like burglary and violence, they stop after the age of 39, and their rate of conviction goes down in the 30s, so there is a kind of spontaneous change. Now, whether this would accelerate, I mean, what you would want to do is accelerate that change so that they didn't have to reach the age of 39 before they stopped committing those crimes. And my guess was that this did actually have an effect, but I have no proof of that. I have no proof that this.
And I don't know of any studies that look at autobiographical writing and recidivism.
Well, it would be very difficult because it would be very difficult.
Very.
Yeah, I mean, it would be difficult to find the control group and so on. So, but I mean, instinctively, I felt that this was a good thing to be doing.
Well, insofar as thought is useful and verbal thought is high quality thought, you'd hope that it would be helpful. Okay, so how did your conclusions change your clinical practice for the better, let's say, in your opinion? And what about social policy suggestions?
Well, the first was clinical practice. It made me very wary of medicalisation of misery. That's the first thing. So that I spent far more time persuading people not to take medication than to take it. In fact, there's a kind of law in prison: if people want medicine, they don't need it, and if they won't take it, they do need it. So, but as far as social policy is concerned, I'm very, very wary of making, and perhaps this is very cowardly of me, very wary of making any suggestions, because if anyone were to take me seriously and the results were catastrophic, I would feel very bad. So,
well, it's an
actually, I think also that actually what we need is a cultural change, and I'm not sure how much government can bring about a cultural change. So I was trying to, in my way, trying to persuade people, particularly the intellect. Maybe this is grandiose, but I was trying to persuade intellectuals that a lot of their world outlook was bad and was doing harm rather than good.
And to be cognizant of that, to be cognizant of the fact that radicalism translated down the socioeconomic hierarchy is often devastating.
Yes, yeah. So that the destruction of the family, which rich people perhaps can survive, is devastating for people who need solidarity, social solidarity, more than anybody else. And that the social solidarity, which now runs entirely through the state, is a very cold form of solidarity that is very unpleasant.
That's a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your conversation. I've appreciated for talking with me today. I hope everyone finds this useful.
Yeah, I hope so. I don't know whether how many people watch or see it.
Oh, here it is. Yeah.
Dr. Jordan Peterson's work as a clinical psychology professor at the University of Toronto has catapulted him to international fame with arguments that are challenging and changing the way we all think. He has captured the attention of millions, especially of young men, but some young women as well. And many of you, however, have never heard of him, but you will get to know him for the first time through this interview. Today he is here, breaking down his provocative rules for life and the prescription for success that will surprise many of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
So it is an interesting group of insights that you offer us, and I can enter it in many ways. But let me just start with, for me, perhaps the most obvious, which is what is it that you're saying that's resonating with so many people? What itch are you scratching?
I think there's probably two. We've had a long conversation in our culture about the necessity for self-esteem and happiness, and that's not what I'm talking about. I tell my audiences and my readers very straightforwardly that life is difficult and that there's a lot of suffering in it, and that you have to learn how to conduct yourself in the face of that. The problem with the pursuit of happiness is that when life storms come along, happiness disappears, and then you're left with nothing. And so you need to pursue something that's deeper than happiness. And if happiness comes along, well then, hooray for you. You don't want to despise it because it's fleeting, but it's much better to pursue things that are meaningful than things that make you happy. It's deeper and it orients you more appropriately, and it keeps you centered in your own life. It makes you more useful for your family and your community. So that's one thing. And it's a relief to young people to know that the baseline conditions of life are difficult, but that you can still prevail. So it's a funny message in some sense, or a strange message, because on the one hand it's somewhat pessimistic. Now I talk about suffering and malevolence also, but I also emphasize the fact that despite that being the base conditions of existence, people are tough enough to prevail. So that's one element of it. The other element is the necessity of responsibility. So a lot of what people find in life that provides them with a sustaining meaning is a consequence of not the pursuit of rights or the pursuit of happiness or the development of self-esteem, but the adoption of responsibility. And the more responsibility, in some sense, the better. Responsibility for yourself, for making sure that your life lays itself out like it should, responsibility for your family, responsibility for the community. It's people who take responsibility that are the ones that you admire, and that's the right pathway through life. That's where meaning is to be found. And I think that's probably the crucial issue, is that identification of a profound relationship between responsibility and meaning. And for many of the people that I'm talking with, it seems like that's the first time that that's been articulated for them.
So speaking about responsibility and meaning and how to make sense of a world where so many people feel isolated, I'll come back to that. That seems so helpful. And yet you've been a lightning rod in many ways, with a lot of harsh comments, especially in the print media. What is it that your critics are arguing?
Well, I got embroiled in some political dispute, I would say, on my home front in Canada when our government introduced some legislation that purported to be about compassion, which to my way of thinking was about compulsion with regards to speech. And so that's tangled me up. But I also think that people aren't necessarily that happy with a message of personal responsibility when they're really interested in the mechanics of social change. Now, my sense is that, well, life is unfair. Social structures are unfair. The arbitrary way that illness is distributed into the population is unfair. But despite that, the best level of analysis for rectifying that, in a practical sense, but also in a psychological sense, is the level of the individual. And so people who think in a collectivist manner, or people who are playing identity politics games that insist that your group identity should be your hallmark, don't like what I have to say at all. And they have their reasons. I'm not a fan of identity politics types. I think it's a very, very dangerous game, particularly because it makes us tribal. And tribal people are very dangerous. You know, as we degenerate into our tribal groups, the probability of violence increases, as far as I'm concerned. That's what the anthropological data would suggest as well. So the collectivist types don't like me very much.
You're a clinical psychology. I mean, it's a challenging profession. You chose it coming out of a rural town in central Canada. How did that advance your life journey? What in your life has inspired you to do what you do now? And especially to take some of the public steps now that are drawing criticism to you, which is always painful.
Well, I've always been obsessed with totalitarianism and authoritarian governments, whether they're on the right or the left. I mean, for years, decades really, I spent almost all of my free time thinking about what happened in Nazi Germany and in Russia during the Soviet era, but also in Maoist China. There were other places as well. Trying to understand how it was that we could have got off the rails so absolutely terribly. And I started studying that at the collectivist level, I would say, looking for political reasons or economic reasons. But as I investigated further, those levels of analysis became increasingly they weren't providing the answers that I wanted. I think partly because I was really interested in the notion that there's something to learn from what happened, say, in Nazi Germany. But there's something to learn at an individual level. That's my estimation. I don't think that there were innocent masses of people led astray by a single malevolent leader. I don't think the fundamental motivations for what happened in Nazi Germany were economic. And I don't think they were in the Soviet Union either. As I read more and more about the situations, I realized that the proclivity of individuals to avoid responsibility and to lie, especially about their own lives and about their own experience, were really the reasons that those systems went so long. Discussion of responsibilities for a variety of reasons. First of all, the actual reason that you have rights is so that you can discharge your responsibilities. It's not the other way around. It's like you're granted rights by everyone around you, or no, it's not granted exactly. It's part of the purpose of your rights in some sense is so that you can be given an autonomous space that's protected, in which you can manifest what's necessary about you in the world that's a contribution to it. So I have to leave a space for you so that you can make your contribution for yourself, so you can take care of yourself, so that you can shoulder responsibility for your family, and so that you can serve the community the best way that you can. And I don't want to set up a society that will interfere with that. But then, and then there's the association that we already talked about between responsibility and meaning, which is absolutely crucial. And so it's the responsibility element is more important than the rights element as far as I'm concerned, or it certainly is at this point in time. And people know this. They instinctively know it.
And yet, the role of the victim seems, which is a painful role to have, because something bad happened to you to be a victim. But it's something that society struggles with. So what about people who feel like they're a victim?
They're right. They're victimizers too. Like everybody is a strange mixture of victim and victimizer. Lots of terrible things happen to people that aren't justifiable in some sense. You know, well, illness strikes people randomly. I mean, not entirely randomly, obviously,
Not
but
at
there's
all
a
random.
there's a large random element in it.
Muttering.
Where you're thrown into existence as a consequence of your birth. That's the existentialists, especially the 1950s, talked about that all the time. They talked about it as thrownness, that you're sort of thrown into reality with your particular set of predispositions.
Yeah, and your parents start to kill you from the day you're born, and then you take over as soon as you hit your teen years. The vaccinations, the food, all the lies.
Equally
do
distributed
it.
privileges as well. And so that's the arbitrary nature of existence. And but you can't allow those sorts of things to define you, because it's not that useful strategically.
The entire environment, actually, poisoning our lawns so that we have a nice green lawn, giving no thought to generations that were playing on the lawn and what their lives are going to be like in the future because of all the cancer-causing chemicals we put into our lawns, for one example, right? And all the other toxin, drinking out of a plastic, drinking and eating and warming up in microwaves and plastic bowls, plastic dishes, all that kind of crap, right? Millions of examples of how we do
The
it.
point is, you don't have a better strategy, and neither does anyone else.
Yeah,
And
we do.
then it's also not so obvious how privilege and victimization are distributed. You know, if you take someone who's doing quite well in life and you scratch underneath the surface, you generally don't have to scratch very far until you find one or more profound tragedies of the past or perhaps of the present. You know, and no matter how well protected you are in the world, you're still subject to illness, you're still subject to aging, you're still subject to the dissolution of your relationships, the death of your dreams, death itself. So vulnerability is built into the structure of existence. Now, if you start to regard yourself as a hapless victim, or even worse, an unfairly victimized victim, well, then things go very badly sideways for you. It's not a good strategy. You end up resentful, you end up angry, you end up vengeful, you end up hostile. And that's just the beginning. Things can get far more out of hand than that. So strategically, it's a bad game. It's better to take responsibility for the hand that you've been dealt. You've got no better protection in life than doing that.
This is where a lot of folks in the modern West get unsettled, because we have been brought up to believe that we need to be compassionate to each other. And yet you point out that sometimes that compassion, I don't know if it encourages weakness or it's another word for weakness. And I'd love if you could open that up for me, because it is the kind of discussion that gets folks really unsettled.
Well, feeling sorry for someone is not a moral virtue. You know, morality is much more complex than mere reflexive empathy. So I would say, when is reflexive empathy useful? That's easy. You're a mother. Your child is under 6 months old. Reflexive empathy is the right reaction. And I think that's...
No, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. All the books you read, that's about not being able to take more from life than what you need. It's even easier and more simple and more broad than just women only taking care of babies. Like I heard you do this already 3 or 4 times. No, that empathy neuron, that the mirror neuron, it's to prevent humans from taking more from life than what we need. So it was put there most likely by the false creator. We know from your friends that, what am I at, 37 minutes? The guy that was working in the jails and working in the prisons, he will tell you, he can let you know, a very small percentage of the people that are in prison do not possess a mirror neuron, that are psychopaths. Very, very few. Less than 1% of people in jail for violent crimes don't possess a mirror neuron. Or, you know, they consider them psychopaths. But if we went and looked on the street, we would find the psychopaths working for the head of our school boards, their teachers, their lawyers, cops, their bankers, their physicians, doctors, psychiatrists, therapists. The true psychopaths are all over the place. They're not the dangerous criminal in the way that you've been selling. They are dangerous and they are criminals, but we don't look at them that way. Society's not allowed to look at them that way. We say that they're good and they're doing good for good people and all this. So how do you get 7.8 billion people to lie to themselves like that, really, right? How do you get 7.8 billion people that possess a mirror neuron that prevents them electrically? It's an electrical system. So electrically, just like a computer, how does it go against itself? How does the computer know to lie to itself, right? That's the mirror neuron manipulator. The mirror neuron manipulator bypasses the signals from that mirror neuron going up to your brain. So your brain is only a memory capsule. If you memorize all the lies, then you can believe and really believe those lies. But if your mirror neuron's in the way, then as you hear the lies, you will not even accept them. That's why you need the mirror neuron manipulator, unless you're a psychopath. If you're a psychopath, you don't need them. You don't need the mirror neuron manipulator because you don't have a mirror neuron. So therefore, you can just take more from life than what you need without any thought, consequence, or no 2 ways about it. They make the best soldiers. They make people that can make snap decisions. They make the best evil villain. So That's what that boils down to, anyways. Why you guys don't know this? I don't believe that you don't. I think you do, and you're dancing around it because you're dancing around it again right now with Dr. Oz, and I know Dr. Oz for a fact is full of shit.
It's associated with a complex set of ideas. If
But
you're
that-
not,
Sorry, but that principle right there is a stark differentiator of you from much of the material that I read. Right? Generally, it's purely about compassion. You use the word victimhood, but a lot of folks do feel it's a virtue to feel sorry for others because usually behind that is I'll do
virtue's
something.
not that easy.
No.
That's the problem, is that we wouldn't have to think if empathy guided us properly. But it doesn't. It guides us properly in some very specific conditions. It can also make us very dangerous because, and there's good experimental literature on this, if you're very sensitive to an in-group's claims, whatever they might be, that makes you very hostile to perceived out-group members.
In-group, out-group, people within your tribe versus
Yeah,
outside your tribe.
within whatever group it is that you're identifying with at that moment. You know, so empathy drives that in-group identification. It's like, okay, well, what about the out-group? Oh, those are predatory. Those are predators. We better be hard on them. You know, it's a mother bear's compassion that gets you eaten. So we can't be thinking that empathy is an untrammeled virtue. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. The psychoanalysts knew this perfectly well as well, when we were still wise enough to attend to their more profound realizations, and that's the motif of the devouring parent. The devouring mother is a more general trope, and that's someone who will do absolutely everything for you all the time, so that you never have to rely on yourself for anything. That's not good. No, there's rules. For example, if you're dealing with the elderly in an old folks home, here's a rule: never do anything for one of your clients they can do themselves. Why? Because they're already struggling with the loss of their independence. And you want to help them maintain that independence as long as possible. And that might mean sitting by while someone struggles to do up their buttons, for example, when you can, and this is the same if you're maybe helping your 3-year-old dress themselves. It's like, yeah, you can put on the buttons a lot faster. Let me help you with that. It's like, no, you struggle with that. You master it. And I'll keep my empathy to myself. Thank you very much. So that I can help you maintain your independence. So.
And that suffocating mother is Ursula,
That's right.
right? The Little Mermaid.
Yes.
So these motifs still sneak into our culture.
Sure, well,
Why?
you see it in Sleeping Beauty as well, in the Disney movie, where the evil queen keeps the prince plans to keep Prince Charming locked in her basement, fundamentally, chained up until he's so old he's useless, right? And she's the force that stops him from making an alliance with the young woman and having his life, right? I'll just keep you chained up here where you'll be safe. It's like, no, you don't need that. You know, what did Freud say? I think it was Freud. The good mother necessarily fails, right? Because as your child emerges, as your child develops, you're a perfect mother up till 6 months. You take care of your child's every need. Okay, well, at somewhere between 6 and 9 months, the child starts to crawl around, starts to become a bit autonomous, starts to be able to do little things on his or her own. You back off. Every time the child steps forward, you step backwards. And maybe you step backwards a little faster even to motivate your child to step forward. And then what you're saying is, it isn't you I care about, it's who you could be. And see, that's another thing that I'm talking to young men and young women about. It's like, it isn't you I care about, it's who you could be. You think, well, that's pretty harsh. It's like, not when you're talking to 18-year-olds. It's like they have their whole life ahead of them. Whose side should you be on? The 18-year-old kid who's confused, oh, you're okay the way you are. It's like, no, you're not. You're not even close to okay the way you are. You haven't even started. You're not who you could be physically. You're not who you could be spiritually. You're not educated to the degree you could be. You could really be something, man. You got 60 years to work on it. Get the hell at it. That's way better. That's a way more positive message, even though it's got that strange harshness about it, because it's judgmental. Every ideal is a judge. You can't get away with it. Can't get away from it, right? Or with it. You put something up as an ideal that it stares down at you and says, you are not what you could be. Every great piece of art does that. And to tell young people, it's like, no, you're not okay the way you are. That's why we have universities. That's why we have training programs. It's like, you don't know enough to go out there and change the world. You're not out there waving placards around and telling people how to behave. Get your act together. Learn some skills. Educate yourself. Learn how to speak. Learn how to conduct yourself. Learn how to stand up. Make yourself a force in the world. There's way more to you than you think.
You appreciate why that message would resonate with some but scare the heck out of others.
Should scare the heck out of everybody. You know, that's what they say. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Like, there's real truth in that. And this is I think, and this is what scared me. I learned from studying Auschwitz and the terrible things that I studied for many, many years.
Don't have to fear God. You have to fear the human influence. God's not scaring anybody. It's the human influence.
It comes down to individual integrity. All of these things. If the state is corrupting around you, that's on you. It's your responsibility. You think, well, how can I take on that responsibility? It's like, be more than you are. So, and how could you not be afraid of that? Well, of course you'd want to shy away from that. But the alternative is far worse. It's far worse to let things degenerate. Like, you have a chance, you have the opportunity to contend with the structure of reality and to set things right. You can do that if you take it on voluntarily. And that's a terrible burden, to confront suffering and malevolence, especially.
Then why not take out all the distractions? They're all false reality anyway. They're all just about using their imaginations. So why not take all that out of it all? So therefore, the educational process would not need an indoctrination system. The schooling that we would do would be totally different, and it would be based on reality and honesty and truth, rather than what it's been based on for the last couple thousand years, including philosophy, all the famous writers, all the religions, all the science, all
But
the
there's something
medicine.
within us that's even greater than that. And so that's the fundamental reality. You don't get to that either unless you start with what's so terrible, saying life is rife with suffering and injustice, and we make it worse with our malevolence. It's terrible. Okay, well, that's horrible. Who can withstand that? It's like, yeah, well, if you look inside that, you see that something beckons, and what beckons is the possibility of what you could become if you confront that. And that's what we need to know. And that's, I think, integrally tied up with our most fundamental religious convictions. We know that people have an indomitable divine.
Yeah, so send half the population in the brick walls and send the other half of the population into the other side of the same brick wall. That's all that's going to happen by doing what you're doing here. Let's show everybody. Let's just show it to them. Let's let everyone see it, and let them see it for themselves and judge for themselves on what it is they're looking at, instead of hiding it with all these distractions of philosophy and science.
Alberta at that time, yeah. Well, I was thinking about the sorts of things that we're talking about now. I've been thinking about them ever since I can remember, but, you know, I've got better at thinking about them across time. But I had a lot of the problems, I suppose, that the typical 18-year-old would have. I drank a lot. I come from this little town in northern Alberta. Heavy drinking. I started drinking when I was 14, so I was quite a partier. I was confused existentially, I would say. I wasn't sure what the proper direction in life was. I was very much obsessed with the problem of the Cold War. That's never really gone away, because that seemed to me to be just a kind of insanity that I didn't know how to fathom. And, you know, it was all of that, and I was obsessed with reading and obsessed with learning, and so that was what all drove me in this direction. And then as I started to develop these ideas, like, I had to let go of things. You know, one of the ideas that I've been promoting to people is that you have to let the dead wood burn off. And you do that as a consequence of necessity, in the pursuit of responsibility. When I started writing seriously, I had to stop drinking, because I couldn't think properly. So that was it. It was either like, you're going to do one of these or the other. You're either going to continue wasting your time. I was having a fine time. I was in graduate school, and I had I was very, very social. And a lot of that involved drinking and that sort of thing. Couldn't do both, especially when I was editing. I couldn't get my thoughts down pristinely enough, precisely enough. Plus, the emotional magnitude of the things that I was dealing with were more overwhelming if I was, well, in the aftermath of a party, you know. So I decided when I was like 25 or so to just stop.
I've been caught off guard by how politicized you've become, and as I read of your youth, I know that you had your run-ins with religion, which a lot of people do. You actually got politically active, but on the left, not the right. Help me understand what went down.
Well, in the little town I grew up in, the member of parliament, the provincial parliament, equivalent to American state, was a democratic socialist. He was the only one in the entire province. Everyone else was conservative, which would be sort of moderate Republican, I would say. And, there's something to be said for political voice for the working class and for the dispossessed. And it certainly is the case that the hierarchical structures that compose our society, do produce dispossession. They stack people up at the bottom. And so people at the bottom need to have a political voice. And so I was very attracted to that end of the political spectrum. But as I came to investigate some of the problems I've been discussing more deeply, I started to understand that mere economic rectification was insufficient, that wasn't the level of analysis that was appropriate for my inquiry anyways.
Translated, redistribution of income doesn't work.
Well, think about it this way. The guaranteed basic income idea. It's like, well, that's predicated on the idea that man lives by bread alone. Well, that isn't how it works, and I've certainly seen that in my clinical practice. I've had clients, especially addicts, if you gave them money, they would die. And the reason for that, like one guy that I remember in particular, I liked him quite a bit. He had a bad cocaine problem. And as long as he was flat broke.
What about a bad food problem? What about the people that we give money to and they eat the food, what we call food, right? So they die slowly, right? They don't just have an overdose like the guy with the drugs like you're talking about. They just die slowly of cancers, diabetes, thousands of different diseases actually, all created by the medical industry and the food industry, right? So in the form of a question, of course that is, I'm asking you that. Don't you think that it's strange that you're pointing out that you could attribute to something like that as far as a drug user, but then you can go read the books that about, let's say, for example, the Bushes and the Clintons being some of the biggest drug dealers in the United States ever. They were responsible for allowing arms and drugs and all kinds of shit to come, just like thousands of others, probably tens of thousands of others, politicians running our country since the beginning, that is. So they bring them all the drugs in. None ever happens to them for doing so. They don't go to jail, but the average guy on the street that's doing the drugs, he gets busted down. He's the one that's going to be in jail. He's the one addicted. He's the bad guy. Okay, fine. Okay, I get that. But why are the people that are allowing it to come in not the bad guy too? Why are they not involved in being the bad guy? I don't get that. And here you go again. You're doing it again now because we're going to again bring, and you're doing it in a nice way. Don't get me wrong. You're doing it in a way that shows that you're having concern for that, drug user, and making a point that if you gave him money, he would certainly go kill himself. But no thought process to all the other ones, because the doctors do the same fucking thing. It's just that if you kill us slowly, then that's okay. That's strange to me that we all do this blindly, because here you are, everyone's nodding their head. Yes, this makes a lot of sense as they're listening to you talk right now.
I deliver a lecture that's very much like this conversation. It's
I
like
would have too.
lay out the structure of life, the fact that it's rife with suffering and malevolence, that we erect hierarchies in an attempt to deal with that, to deal with those problems, because they're too alike, that the hierarchies dispossess people, and so we have to take care of the dispossessed as well, and to draw out the relationship between meaning and responsibility. And the audiences are rapt as a consequence of that, and I'm always listening to my audiences as, when are they silent? Because when everyone in an audience is silent, then everyone's in the same place. That's a meaningful place. They're all lined up, and they line up on this axis of responsibility and meaning. So there's a hole in our culture where this information hasn't been provided.
But it was there at times in our history, which has been the thing that I struggle with, which is the issue of sacrifice. It's so paradoxical, right? Why would me giving of myself to you make me feel better? It does seem like most of the time, if I have money, I give you some of my money, I have less money. But you're arguing that if I understand true sacrifice and I sacrifice myself for something that has meaning,
Well, part of it is, human beings discovered time. That's one of the things that makes us very peculiar creatures. To be aware of our own mortality is a consequence of the discovery of time, right? We can see how we.
Sure, and we lied about that as well because we shortened our lifespans and now today claim that we live longer today than we did 150, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, which is a lie. It's not true. You're looking at oranges to apples with the statistics because if you look at the population, there's, you're talking about a time when there's 2 million, 3 million people in the country, and then you bounce forward and compare it to when there's 350 to 380 million people in the country. You're comparing oranges to apples when it comes to those things and how long we live. That's just in this short time period. Then when you go back hundreds of years, thousands of years, the lies even get greater because then they start using carbon dating on bones and tell you how long the person lived and everything. All false science. So they're just lying. They're lying ass motherfuckers, man.
The present for the future, and that was one of the great discoveries of mankind, right? Which is something that I also concentrate on in 12 Rules because I'm really interested in the issue of sacrifice. Why would you give up something now? Why would you ever give up something now voluntarily? And the answer is sometimes if you give up something now, and often something you love, something you're very in love with even, perhaps not for the best reasons, then you can make a bargain with the future. And that bargain with the future isn't any different than the bargain you make with other people.